You're too heavy for my horse. Merchant rejected obese girl, mountain man carried her himself. The summer sun hung merciless over Fort Laramie in the Wyoming Territory, 1837. Dust devils danced across the parched earth where trappers, traders, and travelers congregated around the bustling trading post. The air smelled of horse sweat, wood smoke, and opportunity, the particular scent of the American frontier where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card or the quality of a beaver pelt. Sarah Hutchins stood beside the merchant's wagon, her face flushed crimson beneath her bonnet. At 23 years old, she carried herself with dignity despite the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Her frame was substantial, her dress straining at the seams, but her eyes held an intelligence and kindness that most folks overlooked in favor of cataloging her physical shortcomings. "I already paid you half in independence," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We had an agreement, Mr. Blackwell." Silas Blackwell, a rail-thin merchant with a pencil mustache and calculating eyes, shook his head with theatrical regret. "That was before I knew the full extent of the situation, Miss Hutchins. My horses can't bear such weight all the way to Oregon. It ain't personal, just simple arithmetic." Around them, a crowd had begun to gather. Frontiersmen in buckskin, soldiers from the fort, Lakota traders with their travois loaded with buffalo hides, all stopped to watch the drama unfold. Sarah felt each stare like a brand against her skin. "You can't just leave me here," she said, hating how her voice cracked. "I sold everything I had to make this journey. My aunt is waiting for me in the Willamette Valley." Blackwell scratched his chin, making a show of consideration. "Tell you what, you lose 40, maybe 50 pounds, and we'll talk about you joining up with another wagon train come spring. Best I can offer." Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel, thoughtless laughter that confirmed every fear Sarah had harbored since childhood. She had endured such mockery in Philadelphia, had fled west hoping for a fresh start, only to find that cruelty knew no boundaries of geography. "Your horse carried 200 pounds of flour without complaint," Sarah pointed out, her chin rising defiantly. "I watched you load it myself." "Flour don't shift around or spook the animal," Blackwell countered. "You want to ride to Oregon, you slim down or you find another way. Them's your choices." Sarah's hands balled into fists at her sides. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these strangers who had already judged her and found her wanting. She had survived worse than public humiliation. She had survived. "Reckon I can help with that." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, deep and rough as river stones. The assembly parted to reveal a man who seemed hewn from the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and his hair hung past his collar in dark waves. He wore buckskin trousers and a worn leather vest over a homespun shirt, and a large Bowie knife hung at his hip beside a well-used Hawken rifle. Mountain man, Sarah thought. She'd seen them before. Solitary figures who came down from the high country to trade furs and resupply before disappearing back into the wilderness. They were a breed apart, harder than the rocks they climbed, wilder than the animals they hunted. "This ain't your concern, Bridger," Blackwell said, his tone wary. "Making it my concern," the mountain man replied, his gray eyes fixed on the merchant with an intensity that made Blackwell take a step back. "Lady paid you for passage. Honor demands you deliver." "I told you my horses—" "Your horses are fine. Your character's what's lacking." Bridger moved through the crowd with surprising grace for a man his size. Up close, Sarah could see the weathering of years on his face, the small scars that spoke of close encounters with claw and bullet and blade. She placed his age around 35, give or take. "Where you headed, ma'am?" "Oregon City," Sarah managed, startled to be addressed directly. "My aunt runs a boarding house there. She's expecting me." "That's a far piece." Bridger studied her for a moment, and Sarah braced herself for the judgment she had seen in countless other eyes, but his gaze held no mockery, only assessment. "You got supplies?" "Some, enough for the journey if I'm careful." Bridger nodded once decisively. He turned back to Blackwell. "Give her back her money. Now see here. All of it, every cent. Something in Bridger's tone suggested that arguing would be unwise. Blackwell muttered under his breath, but reached into his coat and produced a leather purse. He counted out bills and coins into Sarah's outstretched hands, his movements jerky with suppressed anger. There, we're square, and I'll thank you not to interfere in my business again, Bridger. Then conduct your business with honor, and I won't have to. Bridger waited until Blackwell had stomped back to his wagon before addressing Sarah again. You got a bedroll? Good walk-in boots? Yes, but I don't understand. I'm heading west myself. Got business in the Blue Mountains, then I'm wintering near the Columbia. Oregon City's on the way. He paused, and something that might have been a smile flickered in his eyes. Could use the company. Gets lonesome, talking to yourself for weeks on end. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Mr. Bridger, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't possibly walk all the way to Oregon. It's over 1,000 miles. Closer to 900 from here, but who's counting? That almost smile again. And we won't be walking the whole way. There's river passage part of the distance, and I got a cache of supplies and 2 good mules waiting at Independence Rock. We'll manage. I don't have money to pay you. Didn't ask for any. Bridger adjusted the rifle on his shoulder. But I will ask that you pull your weight with camp chores. I ain't no nursemaid, and the trail don't forgive weakness. You game for that? Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. Beneath the rough exterior and the dangerous reputation that all mountain men carried, she saw something unexpected. Decency. A code of conduct that meant something out here where law was sparse and survival depended on character. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. You don't know me. Know enough. You got courage, standing up to Blackwell like that. And I know what it's like to be judged for things you can't help. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. My ma was a big woman, strongest person I ever knew in body and spirit. Died when I was 12, and I learned real quick that strength comes in all sizes. Most folks never figure that out. Something in Sarah's chest loosened, a knot she hadn't even realized was there. I can cook, she offered, and mend. And I know medicinal herbs. My mother was a healer. Then we got ourselves an arrangement. I'll get you to Oregon City safely, and you'll earn your keep along the way. We leave at first light tomorrow. Meet me at the North Gate. He started to turn away, but Sarah reached out, stopping just short of touching his arm. Mr. Bridger, thank you, truly. He nodded once, then melted back into the crowd, leaving Sarah standing alone with her reclaimed money and the first real hope she had felt in months. They left Fort Laramie as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Bridger set a steady pace, not too fast but relentless, eating up the miles with the efficiency of a man who knew every rock and ravine of this country. Sarah struggled at first, her legs unused to such sustained effort, but she gritted her teeth and kept pace. She would not give him reason to regret his kindness. The first 3 days passed in relative silence. Bridger was not much for small talk, and Sarah was too focused on putting one foot in front of the other to attempt conversation. Each evening, he would scout their campsite with practiced efficiency, positioning them near water and shelter. He showed her how to gather deadwood properly, how to build a fire that gave maximum heat with minimum smoke. Smoke draws attention, he explained on the 3rd night as she arranged kindling in the pattern he had demonstrated. Out here, you got to assume someone's always watching. Could be friendly Shoshone, could be Blackfeet looking for scalps and horses, could be worse. White men without conscience are often the most dangerous predators on the frontier. You're very cautious, Sarah observed. Cautious men live longer. He checked the surrounding darkness one more time before settling down across the fire from her. You did good today. 14 miles by my reckoning. Sarah felt an absurd flush of pride at the compliment. My feet have blisters on their blisters. They'll toughen up. Everything does out here. He pulled out a whetstone and began sharpening his knife with long, practiced strokes. Tell me about this aunt of yours. Aunt Margaret? She's my mother's sister. Went west with her husband 15 years ago. He died of fever in 34, but she stayed on, built up her boarding house. Sarah poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral into the darkness. She wrote that Oregon was a place where a person could start fresh, said it didn't matter what you looked like or where you came from, only what you could do. She's not wrong. The frontier's got no patience for old prejudices. You prove yourself or you don't, simple as that. He tested the knife's edge against his thumb, apparently satisfied with its sharpness. What about you? What are you hoping to find in Oregon? Sarah considered the question. Peace, I suppose, a place where I'm not defined by, she gestured vaguely at herself, by other folks' limited thinking. Yes, exactly that. Bridger nodded. My given name's Jacob, by the way. Jacob Bridger. Seems silly to stand on formality when we're sharing a campfire. Sarah, just Sarah, she smiled. Jacob suits you better than Hey You or Mountain Man. Reckon it does at that. The days began to blur together, each one a repetition of the last. Wake before dawn, walk until late afternoon, make camp, sleep, repeat. But Sarah found herself growing stronger. Her legs no longer screamed in protest after the first mile. Her lungs adapted to the thin air and constant exertion, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, conversation began to flow more easily between her and Jacob. He told her about the mountains in winter, how the snow came up to your chest and the silence was so profound you could hear your own heartbeat. He described grizzly bears that stood 9 feet tall and weighed half a ton, buffalo herds that stretched to the horizon, and native tribes with customs as rich and complex as any European nation. In turn, Sarah shared stories of Philadelphia, the crowded streets, the libraries filled with books, the theaters where actors performed Shakespeare to packed audiences. She told him about her mother's herb garden and the patients who came seeking remedies for ailments both physical and spiritual. You ever wish you'd stayed in the city? Jacob asked one evening as they made camp near a creek. Sometimes. There's comfort in civilization. But there's also, she paused, searching for the right words, suffocation. Everyone watching, judging, finding you lacking. At least out here, the challenges are honest. A mountain doesn't care what you look like, only whether you can climb it. Truth in that, he said about building the fire while Sarah fetched water. Though I'd argue the mountain does judge you. Just judges what matters. On the 10th day, they reached Independence Rock, a massive granite outcropping that rose from the plains like a beached whale. Names and dates had been carved into its surface by countless travelers, a registry of those who had passed this way before. Jacob's cache was nearby, buried in a carefully concealed pit. 2 mules waited in a makeshift corral, both sturdy animals with gentle eyes. Meet Sam and Delilah, Jacob said, scratching the gray mule behind her ears. Best pack animals you'll find this side of the Rockies. With the mules carrying supplies, the pace became slightly easier. They made better time, covering 20 miles some days. The landscape began to change as they climbed higher. Pine forests replaced scrub grass, and the air took on a crisp edge even in summer. It was on a narrow trail through thick timber that they heard the scream. Jacob's hand went to his rifle instantly, his entire body tensing. Stay with the mules, he ordered, already moving toward the sound. But Sarah followed, curiosity and concern overriding caution. They found the source 50 yards from the trail, a young boy, no more than 8, trapped beneath a fallen log. A woman, presumably his mother, was frantically trying to lift the timber, but it was far too heavy for her alone. "Help us," she cried when she saw them. "Please, I can't get it off him." Jacob assessed the situation in seconds. The log was massive, easily 3 feet in diameter. It would take considerable strength to move it, and the boy's leg was pinned at an awkward angle beneath it. "Ma'am, I'm going to lift on the count of 3. You pull him clear the instant you can." Jacob positioned himself at the log's midpoint, planting his feet wide. 1, 2, 3. His muscles bunched beneath his shirt as he heaved upward. The log shifted an inch, then 2. The woman grabbed her son and yanked him free, just as Jacob let the timber drop back with a ground-shaking thud. "Let me see," Sarah said, kneeling beside the boy. She ran her hands gently along his leg, probing for breaks. The boy whimpered but held still. Badly bruised, maybe a hairline fracture here. She pointed to a spot just below the knee. It needs to be splinted and wrapped. Do you have any whiskey? The woman nodded mutely, still in shock. Good. Give him some for the pain, then give me the rest. I'll need to make a poultice. Sarah looked up at Jacob. I'll need cattails if there are any nearby, and yarrow if you can find it. Creek's back a ways. I'll find what you need. For the next 2 hours, Sarah tended to the injured boy while his mother, a widow named Mrs. Garrett traveling to join relatives in Oregon, watched with tearful gratitude. Jacob built a proper shelter and supplemented their meager supplies with a freshly killed rabbit. I don't know how to thank you both, Mrs. Garrett said as they prepared to leave the next morning. If you hadn't come along, trail takes care of its own, Jacob said simply. You rest here another day or two before you move on, and keep that boy off his feet for a week minimum. As they walked away, Sarah glanced back to see Mrs. Garrett still waving. You do that often? She asked Jacob. Help people? When needed. Most folks out here do. He was quiet for a moment, then added, You did good back there. That boy's leg would have gone septic without proper care. My mother taught me well. She'd be proud, I reckon. The compliment, simple and sincere, warmed Sarah more than any eloquent praise could have. 3 weeks into their journey, summer storms rolled in with biblical fury. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the trail to mud and every depression into a treacherous pool. They took shelter in a shallow cave, huddled around a sputtering fire that Jacob coaxed into reluctant life. This'll blow over by morning, he said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Always does, but it didn't. The storm raged for 3 days, confining them to the cave and testing the limits of their patience and provisions. On the second day, as they rationed their dwindling supplies, Sarah caught Jacob watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. What? She asked. Nothing, just, you surprised me is all. How so? He seemed to struggle with the words. I've known men, strong men, experienced frontiersmen, who would have quit by now, given up. But you just keep going, never complain, never ask for special treatment. You got sand, Sarah Hutchins. I had good motivation to keep going, she said softly, and a good guide. Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but tangible. Jacob cleared his throat and turned back to the fire, but Sarah caught the flush creeping up his neck above his beard. The storm finally broke on the 4th morning, revealing a world scrubbed clean and gleaming. They emerged from the cave to find that a flash flood had washed out part of the trail ahead, forcing them to detour north through rougher country. It was in this rough country, scrambling over fallen logs and navigating steep inclines, that disaster struck. Sarah's foot slipped on wet moss, and she tumbled backward, sliding down an embankment before Jacob could catch her. She came to rest against a boulder, pain exploding through her ankle. Don't move! Jacob was beside her in seconds, his hands gentle as he examined her injury. Can you wiggle your toes? She could, though it hurt abominably. I'm sorry, she gasped. I should have been more careful. Wasn't your fault. That moss is slicker than river ice. He sat back on his heels, thinking. It's not broken, but it's a bad sprain. You're not walking on that for a few days at least. I'll slow you down. Then I'll slow down. He said it as if it were the simplest thing in the world. We'll make camp here, let that ankle rest. But your business in the Blue Mountains? We'll keep. His gray eyes met hers, unwavering. I don't leave partners behind, Sarah, not for anything. They stayed put for 5 days while Sarah's ankle healed. Jacob hunted and fished, keeping them supplied with fresh meat. He fashioned a crutch from a forked branch and helped her hobble around camp when she grew restless. At night, they talked. He told her about the year he spent living with a Crow tribe, learning their language and customs. She told him about the day she realized she would always be seen as different, when a boy she fancied had laughed at the very notion of courting her. His loss, Jacob said flatly. You have to say that. I don't have to say anything, and I don't. He poked at the fire, not looking at her. You're good company, Sarah. Smart, capable, kind, Any man with sense would see that. But not all men have sense. No, most are damn fools. He finally met her eyes, including me, more often than not. There was something in his voice, a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. Sarah's heart began to beat faster, though whether from hope or fear she couldn't say. When her ankle had healed enough to walk again, still tender but serviceable, they pressed on. The landscape grew more dramatic as they entered the mountain passes. Peaks scraped the sky, their flanks dense with Douglas fir and lodgepole pine. Eagles soared on thermals, and twice they spotted mountain goats perched on impossible ledges. It's beautiful, Sarah breathed, stopping to take in a vista of 3 interconnected valleys. It is that. But when Sarah glanced at Jacob, she found him looking not at the mountains but at her. In early September, they reached the Blue Mountains, where Jacob had business with a French-Canadian trader who maintained a small post. The trader, a jovial man named Baptiste, greeted Jacob like a long-lost brother and eyed Sarah with open curiosity. "So, mon ami, you travel with a companion now. This is new, yes?" "This is Miss Sarah Hutchins. She's headed to Oregon City." "Ah, of course. Just traveling companions." But Baptiste's knowing smile suggested he saw more than they were willing to admit. They stayed at the post for 3 days, resting and resupplying. On the final night, Baptiste threw a small celebration, breaking out a fiddle and a jug of applejack. The music and alcohol loosened tongues, and even Jacob allowed himself to relax, his usual wariness temporarily set aside. "Dance with me?" Sarah asked, emboldened by a sip of Baptiste's potent brew. Jacob looked startled. "I ain't much of a dancer." "Neither am I. We'll muddle through together." He rose and took her hand, leading her to an open space near the fire. They moved awkwardly at first, trying to find a rhythm, but gradually fell into sync. Sarah was acutely aware of his hand at her waist, the solid warmth of him. "Sarah," he began, then seemed to lose his nerve. "Yes? You should know." He stopped, frustrated. "Words ain't my strong suit." "Then don't use words." He looked down at her, and Sarah saw the war playing out behind his eyes, duty versus desire, caution versus courage. Finally, he bent his head and kissed her, gentle and tentative, as if afraid she might break. Sarah kissed him back, pouring into it all the gratitude and affection and hope that had been building over the past months. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Baptiste was grinning like a fool in the background. "About time," the trader called out. "I lose a bet with myself. I thought it would happen weeks ago." They left the Blue Mountains as the aspens began to turn gold, heading northwest toward the Columbia River. Something had shifted between them after that kiss, an unspoken understanding that this was more than a temporary arrangement. They held hands while they walked. They slept closer to each other at night. And slowly, in halting conversations around the campfire, they began to speak of futures that might include each other. "I could guide in the Willamette Valley," Jacob said one evening. "Settlers coming in all the time, needing someone who knows the country. Would be steadier work than trapping." "Would you be happy with steady work?" Sarah asked. "You strike me as someone who needs his freedom." "Freedom's worth less when you're alone." He was quiet for a moment. "Never thought I'd say that, but it's true. These past months with you, I've been happier than I've been in years." "So have I," Sarah took his hand. "But I won't trap you, Jacob. If you want to go back to the mountains after you've delivered me to Oregon City, I'll understand." "And if I don't want to go back?" "Then I'd say my aunt's boarding house could use a man who's handy with repairs. And I could use—" She faltered, suddenly shy. "What?" "A partner in all things." Jacob lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "That what you want? To be stuck with a rough mountain man who's better at tracking elk than making conversation? That's exactly what I want. If you'll have an obese girl who can't ride a horse." "You're not—" He stopped himself, seeing the challenge in her eyes. "You're Sarah, and you're worth more than all the gold in California." They reached the Columbia River in late September, its broad waters flowing westward toward the ocean. A small settlement had sprung up at the crossing point, and they were able to book passage on a flat-bottomed boat that would carry them downriver to Oregon City. The journey down the Columbia took 5 days, the boat navigating around rocks and through rapids with skill that made Sarah's heart leap into her throat more than once. Jacob stood beside her at the rail, his arm around her waist, pointing out landmarks. "That's Beacon Rock. And there, see where the river narrows? That's the Cascades. We're almost there, Sarah." Almost there. After 4 months and nearly 900 miles, the end of their journey was in sight. Sarah should have felt relieved, excited. Instead, she felt a strange melancholy. This journey had changed her, shaped her into someone new. What would happen when they reached civilization again? Oregon City, when they finally arrived on a crisp October morning, was smaller than Sarah expected. A collection of wooden buildings clustered around a waterfall, with muddy streets and a population that seemed to consist of equal parts optimistic settlers and skeptical old-timers. They found Aunt Margaret's boarding house easily enough. It was a large, well-maintained building with a painted sign and curtains in every window. Aunt Margaret herself answered their knock, a sturdy woman in her 50s with Sarah's same intelligent eyes. "Sarah! Oh, my dear girl!" She pulled Sarah into a fierce embrace, then held her at arm's length. "Let me look at you. You've grown strong. The trail agrees with you. I had good company." Sarah gestured to Jacob, who stood awkwardly to one side. "Aunt Margaret, this is Jacob Bridger. He brought me safely across the frontier." Margaret assessed Jacob with the practiced eye of a woman who had seen every type of person the frontier had to offer. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she smiled and extended her hand. "Then I owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Bridger. Won't you stay for supper? It's the least I can offer." Over a meal of venison stew and fresh bread, Sarah and Jacob told the story of their journey, the merchant who had rejected her, the long walk, the people they had helped, the storms they had weathered. Margaret listened, nodding occasionally, her eyes moving between them with growing understanding. "So," she said when they had finished, "what are your plans now?" Sarah and Jacob exchanged glances. They had danced around this question for weeks, neither quite brave enough to voice what they both wanted. "Well," Jacob said slowly, "I was thinking I might stay in Oregon for a while, see if the settled life suits me." "And I," Sarah added, "was hoping to help you with the boarding house, Aunt Margaret, if you'll have me." "Of course I'll have you, but something tells me you'll want your own place before long." Margaret's smile was knowing. "Mr. Bridger, there's a small cabin on my property. Came with the land, but I've never had use for it. Could use some fixing up, but it's sound. You're welcome to it in exchange for doing repairs around the boarding house." "That's generous, ma'am." "It's practical, and call me Margaret." She rose to clear the dishes. "Sarah, help me in the kitchen, won't you?" Once they were alone, Margaret turned to her niece. "That man loves you. I know." "And you love him?" "I do." "Then don't let fear or propriety or anything else stand in your way. Life's too short and the frontier's too hard to waste time on nonsense. If you want him, marry him." "He hasn't asked." "Then you ask him. This is Oregon, not Philadelphia. Women have rights here. Use them." That evening, as Jacob walked Sarah back to the boarding house after showing her the cabin, she stopped him in the road. "Jacob Bridger, I have a question for you." He turned, eyebrows raised. "What's that?" "Will you marry me?" He blinked, clearly taken aback. Then slowly, wonderfully, he began to smile, a full, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "I was working up to asking you the same thing. Been practicing a speech for 3 days now. You can give it at our wedding if you like." "I'd rather just say yes." He pulled her close, heedless of who might see. "Yes, Sarah Hutchins, I'll marry you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice." "I already know I did." They married in November, in a simple ceremony at the boarding house with Margaret and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. The cabin, which Jacob had worked tirelessly to repair, became their home. He found work as a guide and wilderness consultant, using his knowledge to help new settlers survive their first winters. Sarah assisted Margaret at the boarding house and began cultivating an herb garden, offering remedies to those who needed them. The first winter was hard, as Oregon winters always were, cold and wet with rain that seemed to seep into your very bones. But they weathered it together, growing closer with each passing day. 5 years later, 1842, Sarah Bridger stood in her garden, one hand pressed to the small of her aching back, the other shielding her eyes from the spring sun. The herb garden had expanded considerably, now including 3 raised beds in a small greenhouse Jacob had built. Patients came from miles around for her remedies. Her reputation as a healer had spread throughout the Willamette Valley. "Mama, Mama, look!" She turned to see her daughter, 4-year-old Margaret Rose, racing toward her with Jacob following at a more sedate pace. The little girl had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined chin, and she was absolutely fearless, scrambling over logs and splashing through puddles with equal enthusiasm. "What is it, Rosie?" "Papa found a frog, a big one." "Not that big," Jacob said, scooping his daughter up and setting her on his shoulders. His beard was shot through with more gray now, and laugh lines crinkled the corners of his eyes. Marriage and fatherhood had softened some of his rougher edges, though he still disappeared into the mountains for weeks at a time, needing that connection to his wild past. Sarah didn't mind. She understood that need, respected it, and he always came home to her, bearing gifts of fresh game and wild stories that kept Rosie enthralled for hours. "Margaret wants to know if we can come for supper," Jacob said. "She's making that pot roast you like." "Of course, though I should warn you, she's probably going to try to set up her new boarder with someone. She's been matchmaking again." Some habits never change. Jacob set Rosie down so the girl could chase after a butterfly. He moved to stand beside Sarah, his arms sliding around her expanded waist. "How are you feeling?" Large, ungainly, ready for this baby to arrive. She was 7 months pregnant with their second child, and while the pregnancy had been easier than the first, she was still uncomfortable in the humid spring weather. "You're beautiful," Jacob said firmly. "Always have been, always will be." Still practicing that speech? "Don't need practice for the truth," he kissed her temple. "I was thinking, after the baby comes and you're feeling up to it, maybe we could take Rosie up to the mountains for a bit. Show her where I used to trap, let her see the high country. She'd love that. So would I." Sarah leaned into him, content. "Can you believe it's been 5 years? Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were walking across the frontier, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." "Best lifetime I've ever lived." Jacob was quiet for a moment, watching their daughter dance through the garden. "You know what I think about sometimes? That day at Fort Laramie. If I just kept walking, minded my own business, but you didn't. You stopped, and you helped, and you changed everything." Sarah took his hand. "You carried me, Jacob, not just those first 10 miles, all the way to a new life, to this." "We carried each other," he corrected. "Still do." Rosie came running back, her hands cupped carefully. "Mom, I found seeds. Can we plant them?" "We can. Come here, I'll show you how." As Sarah knelt in the rich Oregon soil, teaching her daughter the art of coaxing life from the earth, Jacob watched his family with a sense of profound gratitude. He thought of all the trails he had walked, all the mountains he had climbed, all the adventures he had survived. None of it compared to this, the simple, extraordinary joy of being home. That evening, as they walked to Margaret's boarding house for supper, a new family was unloading their wagon in front of the building. The woman looked tired and worried, her husband thin and obviously ill. Sarah and Jacob exchanged glances, and without a word, moved to help. "Welcome to Oregon," Sarah said warmly, taking a box from the woman's arms. "You've come a long way. Let us help you get settled." "We don't have much money," the woman began, but Margaret appeared on the porch, waving away the concern. "We'll figure it out. Right now you need rest and a good meal. Come inside." As they ushered the family in, the woman caught sight of Sarah and hesitated, her eyes taking in Sarah's size, her obvious pregnancy. For a moment, Sarah braced herself for the old judgments, the familiar dismissal, but the woman simply smiled, genuine and grateful. "Thank you, truly. The kindness of strangers has carried us this far. I pray we can pay it forward someday. You will, Jacob said with certainty. That's how the frontier works. We all carry each other. Later that night, with Rosie asleep in her little bed and the house quiet around them, Sarah and Jacob sat by their fireplace. He was carving a small wooden horse for their daughter while Sarah mended a shirt. It was ordinary, domestic, peaceful, everything Sarah had once believed she would never have. Jacob? Thank you. For seeing past what everyone else saw, for carrying me when I couldn't walk, for loving me. He set down his carving and moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. Sarah, I didn't carry you because I was strong. I carried you because you were worth carrying. And you've carried me right back, carried me into a life I never dreamed I'd have, a home, a family, purpose beyond just surviving. We make a good team. The best. He kissed her soundly. And tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after, we'll keep carrying each other. Deal? Deal. Outside, Oregon rain began to fall, gentle and steady, nurturing the earth. Inside, by the fire's warmth, two people who had found each other against all odds sat together, their daughter sleeping nearby, their future growing within and around them. The journey that had begun with rejection and humiliation had led to this: love, family, and the certain knowledge that some things are indeed worth more than gold. The frontier had judged them both and found them worthy, not for what they looked like or where they came from, but for what they were willing to do for each other, for the weight they were willing to carry and the distances they were willing to walk together. In the end, that was the only measure that mattered.